back, my friends, to the show that never ends. We're so glad you could attend. Come inside, come inside. Hi, this is the Chronic Rift, and I'm Judy Fenari. Many have said that Robert Heinlein is one of the grandfathers of science fiction. Today we're going to be grokking and talking about the grandfather time paradox. But first, we'd like to tell you a few things just in case you've had your head in the sand lately or anything else. The Emmy Awards were held 3 weeks ago, and in case you haven't noticed, or out of the country, or had to wash your hair that night, or were in another time direction, Scott Bakula and Dean Stockwell did not win for Best Actor or Best Supporting Actor for their respective roles on Quantum Leap. In fact, Quantum Leap didn't win anything, which is a shame, really. Patrick McGowan of The Prisoner fame won Best Male Guest Appearance in a Dramatic Series for his role in Columbo. Next year, they're talking about giving an award for Best Walk-On and possibly Best Death Scene given by a security officer on Star Trek. Guest appearance, my eye. Speaking of Star Trek, The Next Generation won for Best Art Direction in the episode Sins of the Father. And has anyone seen Patrick Stewart lately? Well, if you were in the research library on Fifth Avenue, you would. He's filming some scenes in the Maps room for a series he's doing for PBS entitled The Shape of the World, which airs sometime in 1991. And speaking of looking out for someone, Colmini, we miss you. We haven't seen you. Don't you like us anymore? We like you. Man. Well, anyway, for Rocky and Bullwinkle fans, there's hope. Fox Channel 5 has begun running the original episodes 11:30 a.m. on Saturdays, which follows the Captain Planet and the Planeteers on Saturdays, which is also running on TBS. You could remember that.
Sure enough, the decoy antenna had been bitten off to a tiny stump, and there beside it lay the mighty moose, sound asleep.
Bullwinkle, how could you do it?
What? How could I do what?
You went to sleep at your post. How could you do it?
Easy, I just closed my eyes. Hey, wait, I didn't go to sleep. I was attacked and put to sleep.
You were attacked?
No, attacked.
Who did it?
It was a... wait a minute, Boo.
The book note for this week is Surface Action by David Drake. This paperback, published by Berkeley Ace, is going for $3.95 and deals with a young man's attempt to stop a Venus colony from making the same exact mistakes that the Earth did and went to its extinction. Very good word. SAT word, possibly. This week's memorable moment is given to us from Orenthal Hawkins, who appeared on the show recently on our roundtable discussion on television flops. And Mr. Hawkins writes, "Guys, I love Snigger Snigger your show, if you can call it that. However, you have failed to recognize the wonderful world of video, which lies so close to the heart of many a science fiction fan. So in this, my memorable moment, from a film originally entitled She Was a Hippie Vampire, now released by Rhino Video as The Wild World of Batwoman, I have struck a blow for B-movie lovers throughout the world. Maniacal laughter, ha 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 ha, etc., etc., etc. From the man who watched The Hypnotic Eye Without Projectile Vomiting, Orenthal Hawkins. And remember, we can only show the memorable moments if you send them to us. And if you send one to us with a return address, we'll be giving you a neat prize for our thanks."
So we meet again, but for the first time on your terms. I can't recall ever being placed in a position where I would perpetuate your evil plans.
I've always told you, Kathryn, there are great things we could do together. Things that could bring unheard of power and riches to both of us.
You know how I feel about you. I'm only here because I have to be, and it won't be for much longer at that. Get on with your dirty business.
Very well, Batwoman. As I've mentioned previously, I want you to get something for me that I've wanted personally for a long time. The Ajax Development Corporation has developed an atomic hearing aid. One that, with certain modifications, could pick up any telephone conversation desired. Since it has this potential, the government has refused the patent and ordered the one model they have destroyed within 30 days. I'm certain an assignment such as this will be entirely within the realm of your own many splendid talents.
So you wish to eavesdrop on every...
Neon, you idiotic fool! What do you think you're doing?
Now the moment I've been waiting for with much bated breath. Here's what I think will be the best comic art commentary in the history of the comic art commentary. Right, Keith?
I don't know. Maybe. Possibly. Anything could happen.
Well, take it away anyway.
If you insist. Hi, I'm Keith DeCandido, critic for the Comics Journal. This is Comic Art Commentary with a hey, na, and a hot shake. Woo! Thank you. American comics have had many turning points throughout its history. Certain years or periods of years that are very pivotal. For example, 1938 to 39, when national periodical publication, now known as DC, put out comics featuring Superman and Batman, which set the mold for the modern superhero. One of these points was the emergence of Marvel Comics, then called Timely, as a publisher of superheroes from 1962 to 1964, with such titles as the Fantastic Four, the Hulk, Spider-Man, Daredevil, and the X-Men, among others. The popular consciousness has thought of Stan Lee as the sole creator of this era, which has been Marvel's official stance for these 30 years. Lee is credited as scripter of these stories, ostensibly collaborating with the artist. For most of them, it was Jack Kirby. Recently, there has been a movement to give Kirby his proper credit for creation of these works. In a recent interview in Comics Journal number 134, Kirby said he created those early characters all by himself, saying that he never saw Stan Lee write anything. This argument has caused much dissension in the field. Some are still asserting Lee's supremacy, some are asserting Kirby's, and many are trying to find some kind of middle ground. Inspired mainly by the Kirby interview and a recent interview with Stan Lee in the Comics Interview number 85, I'd like to put in my 2 cents. To wit, Jack Kirby deserves primary co-creator credit with Stan Lee for the early Marvel characters. I have 7 points to support this assertion. Point number 1. The Marvel style, which is how they created comics in the 60s and how they create comics in the 90s, involves a plot outline given to the artist by the writer, who then does the pencils. The script is based as much on the artwork as the plot, and Stan Lee has said in a number of occasions, including that Comics interview, that the artist usually did the plot anyhow, leaving the script to him. Point number 2. Stan Lee has made a career out of hyperbole, PR hucksterism, and self-promotion at others' expense, despite a veneer of self-deprecation. Anything he says or asserts should be taken with generous doses of salt. Point number 3. Freelancers were quite literally nothing as far as the company was concerned for all of comics history up until the last 10 years or so, and even now they're generally treated like dirt. Jack Kirby was just a hired hand who turned in his work and had no influence whatsoever on company policy. His point of view, Stan Lee's point of view, I should say, would be given more credit due to the fact that he was management. He was an editor. Jack Kirby was nobody. Point number 4. Stan Lee has too many writing credits without Jack Kirby for Kirby's statement that Lee never wrote anything to really hold water. Point number 5. A recent videotape implied that Stan Lee created this totally idiotic character called Solar Man, a Green Lantern ripoff that was going to be a comic and a Saturday morning cartoon. And he was interviewed on the tape giving details of how he thought up the character and the virtues he gave the character, except the closing credits indicated that someone else entirely created Solar Man, which makes one wonder when else he's done this. Point number 6, Stan Lee has said absolutely nothing about this. Every time, up to and including the Comics interview piece, he has refused to comment on the question of who created the stuff. Stan Lee has never been reticent to shoot his mouth off, no matter how little he knows about it, no matter how moronic the statement, on any subject. This lone silence stands out and causes suspicion. Point number 7, and most important, Jack Kirby has been creating things since he started out in Will Eisner and Jerry Iger's studio in the 1930s. He created or co-created Captain America, The Fighting American, numerous comic strips, and the very concept of romance comics, all before he worked at Marvel. And after he left Marvel, he created the New Gods for DC, and when he came back to Marvel in the 70s, the Eternals and the Deviants. Stan Lee created absolutely nothing before 1962, and with the sole exception of the She-Hulk, startlingly original one there, Stan, created absolutely nothing since 1966. His muse vanished with Jack Kirby. I don't think Kirby deserves all the credit, but he does deserve a whole hell of a lot more than he's been given, and is at least as responsible as Stan Lee for the empire that Marvel Comics has built on both of their talents ever since. Speaking of Marvel's empire, this week's comic in review is the latest cog in the Marvel wheel. It is called The New Warriors, written by Fabian Nicieza, with art by Mark Bagley and Al Williamson. The cog in the wheel metaphor is appropriate, since Marvel always appears to be moving, but generally winds up where they started again, despite any ostensible changes. Nicieza was part of the Alan Moore fallout. He first started doing an excellent run on Cyforce, one of the ill-fated New Universe books that Marvel put out. Nicieza is very good at injecting a certain dose of realism into the fantastic world of superheroes. Nicieza is now writing mainstream Marvel titles, including The New Mutants, The Avengers, and The New Warriors. I can't speak to the first two, but the third one sucks. Every super team cliché is present in this book. They are brought together by a common foe, in this case Terrax the Tamer. And all the required components are there. You have the moody leader, Night Thrasher. You have the attractive female, Namorita. You have the neurotic female, Firestar. You have the aggressive male who doesn't know why he joined the team, Kid Nova. And you have the wise ass, Speedball. The writing has none of the depth that Nicieza brought to Cyforce. All the characters here are stereotypes. The dialogue is all typically histrionic and hackneyed with lots of exclamation points. There are some attempts at social relevance, dealing with the environmental crisis, but it comes across as trying desperately to be hip. Bagley's art is competent, boring, homogeneous. Substitute Bob Hall, Jim Fern, Alex Saviuk, Lee Weeks, Mark Silvestri, or any of the other mediocrities Marvel has churning out titles every month, and you never notice the difference. The New Warriors is just the same old, same old. The heroes of the 90s are indistinguishable from anything else Marvel has spewed forth over the last 30 years. The New Warriors is published monthly by the Marvel Entertainment Group, 22 pages an issue, $1 an issue, and is available both at newsstands and comic shops. That's it for Comic Our Commentary this week. Next week, I will be taking a look at Warts and All, a collection of comics by Drew and Josh Allen Friedman. Robert A. Heinlein published his first story, Lifeline, in the magazine Astounding Science Fiction in 1939. He went on to become one of science fiction's most popular and prolific writers, earning him the nickname of the Dean of Science Fiction. Combining humor, memorable characters, and good science, Heinlein wrote both young adult novels, such as The Rolling Stones, Red Planet, and Starman Jones, and adult works, such as The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, Double Star, and The Door into Summer. He wrote the pioneering time paradox short story All You Zombies in 1959, and gave us both the waterbed and the term grok in 1961's Stranger in Strangeland. Heinlein had very set beliefs in matters political and social, exemplified in such novels as Starship Troopers and Farnham's Freehold, and those views are often controversial, and has caused a great deal of, shall we say, violent discussion about Robert Heinlein. His best period was in the 1950s and 60s. The above titles were almost all written then, although he did keep writing until the bitter end, with his last novel, To Sail Beyond the Sunset, published before his death in May of 1988. With Judy and I to discuss this controversial and influential writer are, on my left, Kathryn Cramer, who is the editor of the recently released Walls of Fear anthology, among many others. On the other side, we've got Celeste Hotaling, co-organizer of the Orbit Science Fiction Conventions, and Bob DeCandido, book preservation specialist and Heinlein devotee. Kathryn, why is Robert Heinlein considered the Dean of Science Fiction?
I believe he was given that name in the late 40s. At that time, his novel Beyond This Horizon was considered the best science fiction novel ever written. It's no longer one of his major books. And at the same time, he was also a strong character in the science fiction field. He tended to wear a white suit and had a very strong physical presence. And so he got the nickname the Dean of Science Fiction at that time.
Heinlein, somebody once said, one of the people we approached to be on the show who couldn't be on, said that he was interested in being on the show because he wanted to talk about how Heinlein was a fascist. That accusation was first leveled at him after he wrote Starship Troopers. Would anybody like to comment on that? Is he a fascist?
Well, you know, he addressed that point himself when people began calling him this. And his point was that in Starship Troopers, everybody read it as being a society where only soldiers could be citizens. And his point was that the idea behind the novel, and what the novel actually says, is that to be a citizen, you have to do a service. That to become a citizen, you have to earn the right, you're not born with it, and that the way you became a citizen was to put in a service. Could be military, but it could also be medical. It could be, there were a number of ways that he mentions within the book that you could do it. That, of course, doesn't address the question of later on when some of his views became, sounded very right-wing in any case. But I don't think Starship Troopers is a fascist book. I'm not sure what fascist really means. I've never heard a really happy definition of that term.
Actually, I could speak to this. As to whether or not Robert Heinlein was a fascist, I think James Blish was right in saying that one can argue his political perspectives in a number of different directions. I think when talking about whether or not he's a fascist, we have to think about what the actual effect of his work was. I think that he is part of the same movement within American culture as such directors as John Ford and as such actors as John Wayne in establishing a certain sort of male image of the American, the sort of rugged individual who will sometimes take the law into his own hands to, defeat a corrupt society, and, shoots up the place, etc. Now, John Wayne and John Ford both were members of a group that invited the Committee on Un-American Activities into Hollywood. The same kind of thing cannot be said of Robert Heinlein. And science fiction in general in the 50s was a subversive literature. I mean, we're talking about people forecasting the way the world could be different. And so, this is going on during a conservative era in American history. So while one can say he's a fascist, one can also say, well, no, he's not really.
Look at The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, which was written in the 50s. That was something in which he was basically retelling the American Revolution, only it was the moon breaking away from the Earth instead.
Actually, I've heard that one referred to as a fascist novel, too.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
But I'd like to backtrack to the idea of the rugged man, the rugged individual, because Heinlein has been mentioned before, okay? William Morris, way back in the 1800s, wrote a socialist utopia, which we briefly mentioned last week, called News from Nowhere, in which everyone could do what they want, and whatever was natural they did. And his women could do whatever they wanted, but they naturally wanted to do things like be barmaids and housewives. It's very natural for them to do that. That's what they wanted to do, and that's all they could do. So, he was considered very enlightened for his time period, they would say. That was argued back and forth. Now, Jim Frankel said on our Women in Science Fiction show that the Heinlein woman was the woman who could do anything, but God, where could she get that man? And then I think someone else on our panel that week said, well, he was very enlightened for his time. Now, William Morris in the 1800s was enlightened. What I want to know is, where does Heinlein stand? And he's saying the same exact thing practically same attitude rather, practically 100 years later. Was he enlightened? Was he good for his time? Or was he really sexist, that nasty little word?
The S word.
The S word.
His major point, his absolutely major point was that the individual is the most important thing. That individual dignity and integrity are the basis of all his thinking. And he included all people in that. In fact, he included all creatures in that. And I think I just reread Stranger in a Strange Land because they're coming out with a new edition of it with the uncut portions still left in.
50,000 words left in.
Right. And it is sexist. I mean, we read it now. And yeah, Jim Frankel was right. What they're doing is they're saying, I'm this wonderful, capable woman, and, what I really want to do is go to bed with this man. But he outgrew that. Let's give him a little credit. He wouldn't be the kind of feminist that I am or my wife is. But he does try later on to something that occurred to me that perhaps is a little more relevant and a little clearer to see is in Stranger in a Strange Land, there is this touch of homophobia, right? And there's this at least dismissal of homosexuality. In his later books, you see him growing out of that, I think. I think you see him looking at that from a clearer point of view and taking the philosophical point of view of the individual expressing himself as an individual in any way that is appropriate to that individual.
You've been champing at the bit.
Yeah, right, I'm sorry.
Well, no, I'm just thinking, back to the sexism question. Speaking as someone who has read, for instance, The Cat Who Walked Through Walls, it's really true. I think Heinlein had a touch of wistful longing about women, all women, any woman, any time, any place, three of them.
Yeah.
He didn't outgrow it. It was one of his later novels, and one of the things that irritated me was the fact that all of the women in the novel would meet the male protagonist, our hero, and immediately you knew it was on her mind. It was like, when you ditch her, you're going to see me later. I mean, it was quite obnoxious. There was no reason for them to be so hot for this guy's body. It was just,
Do you think that took away from some of his writing?
Yeah, it became quite annoying. I am a feminist, true. This is true.
The F word.
But, no.
But do you think it took away from some of the storylines, is what I'm asking?
Yes, it did, because it became so irritating. It wasn't just one woman falling in love with him. It became
a constant distraction?
Constant. Yes. It became quite the distraction, yes. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so fond of his so-called juvenile works. I think they're so much more adult in their attitudes about women. I mean, A Tunnel in the Sky. I mean, the men and women get together and they're on the frontier world and they're together. I mean,
Rolling Stones also.
Again, yeah.
Hazel does not go around mooning for men.
Well, when he doesn't have an axe to grind about his attitudes about women, he really couldn't grind the axe in those books because sex was not the thing going on. Growing up, sort of becoming more of a person was what was going on with his characters. I find his so-called adult novels very childish in a way.
Could his adult novels be what they are if they had the same growing up attitude in them?
Well, certainly, because you never stop growing. No matter how old you are, you can always change your opinions and become a better person. But part of becoming a better person was that every woman in the room would go crazy for you. I mean, in his later novels. All right, he's a great mathematician, but for God's sakes.
Actually, I'd like to work a different change on Jim Frankel's definition of the Heinlein woman.
Go right ahead.
The Heinlein woman is the woman who is, tough, capable, bright, could do anything, and gives it all up for the man she loves. It's not sort of for any man, but for the man she loves. And I have heard said, and I think it's probably true, that Heinlein was basing the Heinlein woman on his wife, Jenny Heinlein. And, I think it's quite understandable that he would, write again and again the same woman. And
it's an easy model for him to use.
Well, yeah. I mean, in fact, it's sort of glorifying her sacrifice for his career. I mean, she can stay home and do his filing and file his letters and return his mail.
And isn't she great?
And isn't she wonderful? I mean, isn't this a wonderful model for a woman? So I think that, while I think it would be sort of almost nonsensical to say Robert Heinlein is a feminist, I think one can see it both as a political kind of statement, but also one has to see it in the context of his life.
It's interesting, too, that one of his major interests is children. He's always talking about children and how important they are and how they're the most important thing in life, and he never had any.
Really?
That's interesting.
He didn't, did he? He never had any children.
Don't?
No.
I think he was married twice. I may be wrong, and he may have had children in his first marriage. I don't know.
I think not, but in so many of his stories, he's talking about how important it is to have children and how that's the basic driving force.
He's had so many good children, too, in a lot of his books. Red Planet, the Kids in Red Planet, and Rolling Stones, Castor and Pollux.
Well, see, he did have children.
Yeah, in that sense, yeah, I guess he did.
His books were his children. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Could it possibly be him as a child that he's rewriting, or people that, does anyone know, like, what he...
Yeah. Was he a nerd in high school? What?
I don't know.
He probably
was. The marketing constraints on this is that you're writing for an audience of a given age, which includes fairly young readers who may identify with some of the characters. I mean, for example, the Heinlein juveniles were definitely written for adolescents. And so when thinking about, well, was he longing for children, one could also say, maybe his editor said, put more kids in, you know?
Yeah, if you're writing juvenile books, you should have.
Remember, though, the juveniles were written for very intelligent children, so that does tend to raise the level of the story.
Oh, certainly. No, but it may, but
I mean,
in
he
terms
sort
of
of
having
glorifies the intelligent child, the child who is a mathematical genius, who is whatever, who has that special something.
Yeah. To give another cut, I keep bringing up Rolling Stone. That's one of my favorites.
Oh, it's a good one.
And it had like that wonderful description of how inefficient a car is. You know, in fact, you don't even realize when you're first reading it that he's talking about a car. He's talking about, he's talking about this clunky, inefficient, lousy machine. And it's a very complex, intricate. It's the most intricate description of a car I've ever seen. And then you realize, hey, wait a minute, that's a Ford. You know, what he's talking about here. That was very technical.
Well, that's I think what he does best. He tears down things. He tears down those presuppositions. And I think when Heinlein's at his best, he is destroying things. I read Stranger in a Strange Land as a 15-year-old kid, and it just left me agog because he destroyed the family. He destroyed religion. He destroyed democracy. He just laced into all of it. And not to convince me that they were all wrong, but just to give his readers, at least this is what I got out of it, it gave me a break from it. It pulled me back from those ideas and allowed me to look at them, reassess them in my own way, and from the beginning.
Yeah, well, as Alexei Panshin has pointed out, one of the things that Heinlein does best is create three-dimensional situations, and I think he phrased it well. It's the shock of intellectual recognition.
I think that's all we have time for.
We just started.
Time flies when you're having fun. We'll go out later.
Yeah, right.
Well, thank you very much for being on the show. It's been a whole lot of fun. These are one of the fun ones.
Yeah.
Oh, gosh. Okay. More. Everyone says more, but we can't have more.
We can't have more, but we want more.
Well, you can't have it.
But I want it.
You can't have it! Anyway.
They never let us have any fun here.
Well, too bad. All I would like to say, children, is until next week when we discuss the role of role-playing games.
The role of role-playing games?
The role of role-playing games.
You didn't write that, did you?
Somebody wrote it.
Oh, all right.
Who gets the writing credits?
You and me and John. It's
you and me and, yeah, okay.
Oh, anyway.
You and me and, I'd love to correct, all right, enough. Until we discuss role-playing games, I'd just like to say, what is it? Ton Stoffel.
There ain't no such thing as a free lunch.
Good night.